Well, first off, thank you for coming on here,
Thank you for having me.
for sure. So, yeah, getting right into this thing, how would you describe what the pursuit of wisdom is all about?
Oh, that's that's already the first question. Um,
I get right into it.
the pursuit of wisdom, I call it a responsibility of always trying to essentially be the best version of yourself possible according to the state of consciousness that you're at. It's not necessarily a level for everyone to try and meet at because there's varying levels for everyone. And so wisdom in itself is pretty ambiguous and it can mean a lot different to different people. So as long as it's continuous improvement, that's how
Hmm.
I'd encapsulate it all.
Hmm. Well, what does it mean for you? What is wisdom? I know that's another deep question right off the bat, but how would we describe what wisdom is?
Um, wisdom, it's sort of collating all the knowledge that you've built up within your current state as time goes by. But it's like, well, what can you do with it?
Hmm.
How can I apply it in my life? How can I utilize it? I mean, having different pieces of information is one thing and having it right in front of you. And they can all mean something individually, but then it's making the connections, how they can help each other to then help you. And essentially, it's finding those connections that I see where the wisdom lies in,
I see.
and of course, applying it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it has to be applicable to one's life, right? It's more than just knowledge, information, and data. Something becomes wisdom when you can actually put it to use and make it applicable for one's growth and just overall well-being.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise, what's the point? What's the
Yeah,
point of self-improvement if, you can't actually experience that growth process and enjoy it as well?
very true. Yeah, because if it's not wisdom, then it's just entertainment, like Game of Thrones or something.
Yeah, it's just knowledge.
Yeah. Wow. So how'd you get on this wavelength? Where did this pursuit all come from for you? And I know you're into like the perennial philosophy, as am I. So how did you start to connect the dots and see all of this and bring the wisdom into your life?
So I think in terms of wisdom, I think this is like a two-part answer. So for wisdom, it's always just been curiosity, but it's not something that's privy to myself. It's like within, a child's mind, a curious mind, you're always asking questions, but it's like when you're growing up, for most people, they tend to leave that curiosity behind and accept the world as it is and conform to it. But I think there's quite a lot of us out there that have that little rebellious streak where it's like I'm always going to ask questions. I'm always going to ask why, even if everyone is agreeing on something or disagreeing. And it's the drive to learn.
Mm,
So growing up, I just loved learning multiple disciplines. And the more I learned, the more I collated, the more I was able to see connections that I felt resonated with me. But then in terms of the perennialism, I think one of the disciplines that I was learning was essentially religion and spirituality. Coming from a Muslim Islamic background myself, I would always ask questions about my own religion. I was also raised in a Christian school and neighborhood in a village. And so growing up, I was exposed to similarities, but I was also exposed to differences.
mm,
And then it's like meeting new people from different backgrounds. I was always curious, and then I'm seeing more similarities. And then it just got to a point where the dots were all connecting, and there was something underlying lying behind all of that. And where when I was trying to research, that's when I found non perennialism, just loads of text, and thinking, oh, there is a study of this. I'm not going crazy.
mm.
It's out there, and yeah, that's what led me to the to that world.
Wonderful. Yeah, I see that as well. I like to say the truth is one and the wise call it by many names.
Mm.
Yeah. Now, how would we begin to describe what the truth is and where these dots connect? How would you even get into what perennialism is? Maybe for somebody that has no idea what we're talking about. What is the similarity between all of these different belief systems that you have found?
So it's essentially this primordial reality, something that cannot be divisible, something that it's like all the common denominators of the world's major religions share the root of it. And then you have all these differences, and they're not to be ignored, but the similarities should also not be ignored either. And it's just kind of having a study where all of that comes into one place. So what is it that all these religions share? And could it mean that if they're sharing something, some of these similarities, could that lead us closer to the truth? Um, Something that no one has been able to miss in the nature of reality, metaphysics, God. It's really prevalent, and it's just being able to see through that.
Mm,
Um, and again, it's one of those explanations where you could dive deep into it metaphysically. And I am currently reading Rene Guénon's first book, which is Introduction to the Study of Hindu Doctrines. And he really dismantles all these definitions between metaphysics, philosophy, theology, and it's incredible work, but it's just something I'm just about trying to get my head around.
mm,
But it's like for someone that's starting, it's essentially the similarities between these major religions
yeah.
in terms of God and reality and what they
Hmm.
share.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It's definitely a lot. Yeah. It's a lot to take in, but also I feel as though perennialism revolves a simple idea, and that is a greater power or greater force than just our human minglings here. Just the ego, you could say. Really, that's what all belief systems, all religions revolve around in one way or the other, is that there's something else going on, per se, right? Would you say that is the aspect of it? Is that there is a greater reality, greater force. There is a God.
Higher power.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
higher power. Exactly. They just have different ways to describe it, different languages, different cultures. But at the end of the day, it's it's that there is more than meets the eye. Way more than meets the eye.
I
Yeah,
agree.
yeah. You just have to look at it in the right way. If you look at them in the wrong way, then they could just lead one to false idolatry. I find,
Yeah.
and that's totally missing the point. But I think looking at them in all the different belief systems with a keen eye, you'll be able to see how they are all just pointing in that way. And you'll be able to see through the dogma that society presents for us.
Mhm.
But I feel as though in order to see through it, and maybe you can attest to it, you have to go on a meditative mission. Like, it has to be the books, the knowledge, the wisdom of the sages of the past are all very important for guidance, but at the end of the day, you have to bring it into oneself, right? I think a meditative practice is extremely important, just the overall practice of self inquiry. So, would you recommend that as well as diving into the many, many books and talks and lectures and whatever that we have at our disposal? Would you recommend like a meditative practice as well to aid?
I mean, I do see that there's only so much you can read. And if you're not experiencing it, that's a different kind of knowledge
Yeah.
that you gain in your toolkit, in your growth. And so reading theoretically and experiencing it, it's just two different experiences. They cannot be compared. I think I definitely agree of self-inquiry being the underlying importance of getting that experience first. I think it's a mixture of that esoteric and exoteric. It's
Mm,
that nice balance between the two. I always put for me personally, if I was to study or research all this knowledge or texts and books, it was more so to find the validation for what I was experiencing internally and
yeah.
vice versa. It was like a tennis match rather
Yep.
than I only need one and not the other sort of play, for sure.
Yeah, I like that. It's a tennis match. Hmm. I see it all as like guideposts for self inquiry. All of the external stuff is just to bring me back to the internal stuff, per se. And if it's not doing that, I feel as though it's just a waste of time. It's just entertainment. It's just false
Yeah.
idolatry, as we said. But yeah, if one knows how to play tennis with oneself, then it can be very what's the word I'm looking for? It can be very a useful practice to be able to do that. When to seek the external and when to retreat back to the internal. You know, it is this dance, it seems. I mean, it's
Yeah.
all one. It's all one. It's all the self. But, you know, in describing it here, it is like this dualistic dance of searching for meaning outside that ultimately brings us to the meaning inside. And knowing when to tap into either part of the polarity. And yeah,
Part of the experience, I'd like to believe.
it's part of the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's the experience of discovery. I think so. It's the dance. I like to say it's a dance. Yeah. Do you feel that there is this, from a new age perspective, the higher self or the Holy Spirit or, you know, intuition, the guru that leads
Mhm.
you into certain perspectives, that lead you into certain teachings, or just lead you in life altogether?
I know that I do criticize a lot of modern terms when it comes to spirituality. There's terms called like downloads and channeling, and they're
Yeah.
all stuff that I personally do not resonate with. But I do like to play with the idea from a traditional perspective of, I'm not too sure if you're familiar with the Bhagavad Gita, with
Oh,
the
yeah.
concept of Arjuna and Krishna, with, Krishna being Arjuna's higher self, essentially. And I like the idea of if I had that within myself, but I don't try to entertain it too much where I feel displaced. It's like if it's there, it's from me to me. I am in a safe place anyway. I think separating yourself, I feel like that's the ego's job of the higher self and the lower self, when really it's teamwork. I'd like to
Yeah.
think internally. I'm being
Yeah.
looked after. I shouldn't have to dwell too much into that and separate myself. But I do like to think, I've got my own back,
Mm.
and God has my own back, whether
Mm-hmm.
I see myself as an image of God or not. It's that belief and trust, that I think is important, for sure.
Amen. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the way you put it with teamwork.
Mm,
It's a good way to look at it. It's yeah, teamwork. But before realization, before the dawning of wisdom, I feel as though the ego fights against the team that it's on, that it doesn't know it's on, you know? So I think the whole path, per se, is joining forces, is Krishna and Arjuna working together rather than against each other. And then the ego, I feel, becomes a beautiful servant, you know? Um, the ego is no longer the master, or at least it doesn't think it's the master anymore. So I think that is the path, and what happens when we do have this dawning of wisdom, it is sort of surrender to the team of
mm,
Krishna, of the greater self, you could say, and that's it. And then, like you said, you just have this trust, this faith in the process that leads you down the road of life in all of its twists and turns. And that is truly priceless. You know, once one feels that, it's beautiful. And you never really let it go, you know, once you come into relationship, you could say, with this higher force, you realize that this is it. At least what I feel as though like this, oh, this is it. This is that what I've been searching for the whole time. And I think ultimately we're all searching for it. We're all yearning for it. This connection to a greater whole, you know, a connection to a greater power, a greater force that we spoke of before. And yeah, you just work with it. That's the Tao. You work with it and no longer against it. And from there, yeah, it's like life doesn't really get any easier per se, but it gets easier to go with the comings and goings of life, I feel. It's like Swami Muktananda says, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn how to surf. So I believe this path is us just learning how to surf, learning how to go with God rather than against it, rather than rebelling against God, which I think we've been doing for a very long time. So yeah, ultimately summing that up, I think that's what wisdom leads us to. It's just knowing how to go with the flow, man. Sounds cliche. That's
Learning
another
how
new age cliche.
to move with
Sorry.
the Tao is what I
Yeah.
was saying. Yeah, it's learning the way that reality works. And I think as well with the modern manifestation content out there, there's a lot of trying to control it and making people feel bad or 100% responsible for everything that happens in their reality,
Yeah.
um, which I disagree with because the Tao cannot be controlled, so to speak. You can control where you put yourself within the Tao, amidst it, on it, below it, next to it, you know? But the Tao itself, you have to surrender to it.
Mm-hmm.
We are limited for a reason to experience what it's like to be limitless. But also, if you look at it on the other end, where if you were limitless, you would want to know what it feels like to be limited. So it's you always want something that you can't have, so to speak. But it's
Mm-hmm.
appreciating that if you realize that, you are one, you are both of those dualities, then you can, like you said, like a dance, flicker between the two and go with the flow.
Mm-hmm. And dance the dance. Yes.
Dance, dance.
That's the essence of when Jesus said, he who is not with me is against me. He didn't mean that in a personalized, anthropomorphized sense. He meant that in terms of the Tao. If you're not
Yes.
with it, you're against it. If you're not surrendered to it, you're going against it.
And it's
It's
very
that simple. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Oh, I was just going to say it's very metaphysical,
Yes.
I find with
Mm-hmm.
the Bible. A lot of wisdom and great knowledge there, um, different states of consciousness when reading it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When one goes from Eastern philosophy and then back into Abrahamic religions, particularly the Bible,
Mhm.
I find at least it's like a psychology book. If you know how to take the metaphors and bring them back in, like we said at the beginning, bring this all back in internally, you'll find that it's all stories and parables for you.
Yes.
Ultimately, it's like archetypes, very, very just ingrained archetypes that are ingrained for our growth of our psychology. And yeah, that's the keen eye I was talking about. If you know how to look at it in that way, not some, it might be real. The story might be real. The
Mm.
story of Moses and Jesus and yada yada. That actually might be real. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It's real for you. And if you know how to take those lessons back in, then that's as real as it needs to be. That's the perennialism.
Yeah, I find that very similar for just general mythology. In fact, I do
Mm-hmm.
have my next upcoming lecture is actually the role of myths in human consciousness. So it's quite serendipitous for you to raise that because I do find that incredibly interesting and important because these stories, whether they're real or not, they shape us so much. I mean, you've got theological, religious stories, but then you also have your favorite films, TV show characters, and we connect with them. There's no difference, so to speak. It's because we're utilizing either of them to kind of propel us to grow and figure out who we want to be,
Yeah,
essentially. Yeah.
exactly. And I think in one way or the other, it's all one story. All of
Mm.
these myths and archetypes are touching upon the story of us. We resonate with um, certain messages and missions of these characters in the myths because it's the story. It's the story of the Tao, you could say. And yeah, it's at the end of the day, you can come to find that it's all pertaining to our journey here. Literally everyone's journey here. It's the same exact story. I don't know how else to put it. Many different like motifs and many different themes for sure, but I think it's like all revolving around you. I think that's the theme that we're trying to present here with perennialism. Like no matter what it is, whatever the myth presents on the outside, whatever the appearance is, as long as it comes back to you. And I think if it's written well, it will have that resonance back to you. And that's the story. That's the story of stories. It's the story of you, not his story, your story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
story of stories. That's one way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's all one story. And yeah, that's the story. That's the idea of archetypes with Carl Jung and Freud. I think it's
Mm.
Carl Jung. Yeah, is it Jung or Freud? I don't know. I get them mixed
It's
up.
slightly Carl Jung, but I am yet to delve deep into his works.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's interesting you mentioned the story of all stories, so to speak, because I feel like ultimately it's a story of creation. I think
Yeah.
that's what you might be getting to.
Mm-hmm.
Because in every single story that has ever existed, there had to have been some sort of creation in some form. And
Yeah.
it's that process of seeing that creation take place. And that gets to the end of the story once it's done, whether it's, a physical creation or a development, there's some sort of a goal. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a story.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And there's also, it seems to be in every story, challenge, an
Mm,
adversary, a villain, the darkness to the light. That's the essence of the hero's journey. And
mm.
then the hero persists, triumphs over the light, and kumbaya. I don't know. They live happily ever after. It's hard to say, but I think that's the essence: is the good guys always win. And if you bring that into yourself, what that means, I feel, is that we can triumph over any amount of our suffering, any amount of darkness that our life presents to us. It's like that's part of the journey, that's part of the story. And if you know how to tackle it in the right way and work with the Tao, as we said before, you're able to um you're able to like defeat the darkness, you could say, if you want to look at it in terms of story. And I think we're changing ourselves and to become wiser beings essentially, and we're triumphing over our suffering and our ignorance that we've been living in. I think the good guys are going to win. The light is going to win. There's light at the end of the tunnel. And yeah, it seems to be that's what's happening right now. If this is a story, this is the climax. There seems to be a exponential growth in the novelty of the story that we're living in terms of like our own sense of consciousness and growth and evolution. And yeah, do you feel that? Do you feel as though like we're moving toward a an awakening, a shedding of light of who we really are, and coming to find out what we're supposed to do here, per se, in this life and in the story of our lives?
I think that's a great question. But to be completely honest, I feel like this might have been said throughout the history of our existence. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
every civilization has been feeling that because it's for what they only know to be the spiritual awakening. So every time we get the privilege to look back, we then say to ourselves, oh, we're at the stage of awakening. That could
Uh-huh.
be the case for any point in time in our human existence timeline. And I think it's a wonderful feeling, for sure. But I'm not too sure where my mind is at with whether I truly resonate with that because everyone's got their own individual perspective. The awakening is, I don't think it can be a collective, so to speak. It's down to the individual. Um, I cannot feel to be responsible for other people's awakening because if I am to believe that they are me and I am them in terms of the oneness and the wholeness, then from my own points in consciousness, it's coming from me. So am I the one experiencing awakening in my own individualized self, if I'm making sense? Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I feel
Mm.
like I've seen so many posts where, you know, we as a human race, as a collective, are awakening, and we're definitely getting more knowledge of, science, backing up spirituality, backing up some aspects of different religions, and that is incredible. But I think Aldous Huxley might have phrased this way better than I have, but it's that we impose the idea of progression as if we needed it, but perhaps we never did. And it's, like I said, something that we impose on. Um, with science, technology, we're awakening, not now, but we are going to be experiencing this. But it's all in the now. And I do believe ancient civilizations, arguably, they could have had it all as their own way awakening, and
Mm.
they didn't need anything else. They didn't need the progression. It's we as humans that impose the progression. It's
Hmm.
quite hard for myself to get around this, so I don't expect you to.
Oh, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying there's always this essence of awakening, and there's not like, we may think it's the moment of awakening right now, as I said, but it's a little biased because we're here in this moment. Everybody has a sense of awakening, whether you're in 2024 or you're in 2024 BC. You're saying the essence is like that essence of awakening and rebirth and renewal is always present, and that's part of the perennial philosophy. And it's not really a collective thing. That is just part of the individual psychology.
Yeah, you've articulated that better than me, but yeah, it's all in the now, because the
Hmm.
concept of time, especially linear time, is what gives birth to that wanting to experience progression.
I see.
Because we are somewhat biologically attuned to experience linear time, that's why we think in terms of progression in all aspects of our lives, whether it's learning at school or just,
Mm.
I'm a kid and I'm going to become an adult, then I'm going to become middle aged, etc. Or just like you start a skill and you practice and you improve it, it's that linear progression. But you if you resonate with Taoism and the Tao, then you know that it's the eternal now. And I think, yeah, we impose the awakening experience aspect on ourselves. Not that it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just that we chose it, I do believe.
Mm. Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's just like another archetype.
Yeah, I think so. I would
Hmm.
have to think about it a bit more though. It's a good question.
I get where you're coming from. I think where I was coming from is the essence of creation that we spoke of before. And it's
Mhm.
like, well, if this is a story, then what are we creating? Is it just creation upon creation? And is there any sort of novelty, or is that also just another psychological bias that we put upon it that's deeply ingrained into our consciousness? It might
Mm.
be for sure. But I guess is what I was getting at is what are we creating here? Is this just creation that is just it just continually creates? Is there a collective creation of humanity? I don't think that's a tough question. It's truly hard to answer. I guess just doing some thought experiments here.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's like there's definitely, I do believe we are here to learn lessons. We are here to learn. I feel
Yeah.
like this life that we've all been given is an experience to learn as much as we can. For what reason, I could not know. I could only intuitively guess or make theories of. But it's like, I don't know if you keep like diaries or journal, but journaling is something that I've been doing for 3 years consecutively.
Mm-hmm.
And if you saw a glimpse of my journal in like 2022, I would write as if I had it all figured out. And then I would come to this point now where it's like I really didn't have it figured out back then, sorry. But now I do. But then future me will say the exact same thing, because you can always be your best self in the now. It's only when you have the privilege to look back, it's like, well, what have I created and what have I learned?
Yeah.
And it's that continual process. And it's a very tricky topic um to get your head around and to figure out why, but it's here and it's all we have, so it's like
Mm-hmm.
make the most of it, I suppose.
That's it.
Have fun with it. Yeah.
Yeah. You're right. There's no point in truly entertaining the idea. I mean, there is and there isn't. It's a
Yeah.
simultaneous thing, simultaneous paradox, you could say. Um, but really just comes down to be in the moment. It doesn't matter where this is being created, where we're evolving to. Just be here now. I get that. But yeah, just having a little fun, just entertaining the thought. What do you think we're learning? You know, if is there a, I know it's individualized as we said, but is there a grand curriculum for all of us? You know, is there something that we graduate into?
I think any answers regarding to that question, I think the closest theories we would have is from the religious doctrines,
Mm-hmm.
especially the Abrahamic, because Aldous Huxley made a really good point in the perennial philosophy that stood out to me was that the Abrahamic religions are very time-based.
Mm.
They kind of acknowledge the linear time of like the afterlife and progression and doing good in this world to experience something in the next. There's always something in the next. Whereas compared to say like Taoism and different schools within Hinduism, it's all in the eternal now.
Yeah.
And so I think with the Abrahamic religious doctrines, especially I can only bring up more closely with the Islamic perspective of there's this story. I'm not too sure if it's in the Hadiths or if it's in the Quran directly, but it was just something that I was taught growing up, where I was taught by the teachers that we made a promise to God that even if our memories were wiped, that we would still find our way back to Him.
Mm.
Stood by me growing up, and even to this day, it's like maybe our purpose is to go back to our source for sure, to a certain extent. I mean, I think we could all unanimously agree to that. I think amongst different religions, it's always connecting with God. But learning all these lessons might be necessary to get to that stage. Now, why we made that agreement according to the Islamic story, I have no idea, other than to prove our love to him, I think.
Yeah.
So I like that story. I like the idea of that. Whether I believe it's the truth, it's just something that I'm entertaining right now. It's a theory.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, a test of love ultimately.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very reminiscent of the prodigal son.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the return back, and that's what makes it so glorious. When one is bestowed God realization, that's what makes the miracle is the bestowal. Literally, like the baptism of returning back, you know? And I think as we spoke of before, it's for the experience. It's for the experience of realizing God. It's yeah, that's like yeah, that's what makes it so powerful. It's almost like if you weren't lost in the first place, would being found be such a miracle? You know, I think that's the essence of it. It's like you need to lose yourself a little bit to have appreciation of God, right? I mean, you don't need to. It's simultaneous paradox again. You don't need to because God is always glorious. But I think part of the experience of being human in our human futility is being able to feel the grace of God amidst our futility, amidst our suffering. And that's what makes this experience truly magical, right? It's like amidst the faults, you could say, of our humanness, there is God, despite all of it. No matter how far away, per se, we get from God, there is always the presence of God, that greater power. Like no matter how much we want to ignore it, there is, no matter the circumstances, no matter how dark or bleak it could seem, there is always God. And that's the miracle, right? It wouldn't be such a miracle if we always knew God, right? I don't know. That's just how I find it. I was pretty atheistic for most of my life. Came from a secular family, had no experience of God. I would shoot away. I'd be like, "Oh, get that out of here! Don't say that word, please." And then after self inquiry, diving into many words of the sages of the past, general meditation, I've come to realize that God is realer than real. And that fills me with immense gratitude that I don't think I would have if I didn't lose myself. It's
Mm.
quite hard to explain. Like I don't know. It's like, and I've had moments of literal just like, oh my God, just awe, right? It's just so awe inspiring to be able to have that, to come back home, the return back home and the embrace of God welcoming you back in. It's so magical. And my point is, it's like, would it be so magical? And I don't know if this is an answerable question, but would it be so magical to feel God's love if you never strayed away from his love? It's just a
I
meditation.
yeah, I agree with that, to be honest, because it's like, could you truly appreciate food if you never starved before?
Yeah.
Could you really
Yeah.
taste like the juice of a good apple if you never had a bad apple, you know?
Yeah.
And I really like that. That's something that I hold as like a value personally, within my own life is, whenever I ever experience anything quite negative, um, I let my human self experience it, process it, but in the back of my mind, I acknowledge that if I didn't have this, I would not be able to appreciate the other side of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And it's reflecting that in my diary. It's being aware of it. And I think that is when awareness takes place because it doesn't have a bias between good or bad. It just is there. And it's us as humans where we experience the good or bad.
Yeah.
But it's part of the experience.
Amen. It's the yin to the yang.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
One of the biggest things I love about Taoism is the yin yang
Mm.
symbology and what it brings. Because I mean, I know like non-dualism is oneness, wholeness is great, but I also do love entertaining the idea that we have been limited for a reason. We should be able to embrace it and not always be in one side and not the other. It's a balance, essentially. It's the dance. And we keep bringing it up, but it's true. At least I believe it is true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's I'm gonna try and articulate this, even though it's difficult.
Mhm.
When one just focuses on non-dualism and the oneness, and that's it, just it's all one, it's all perfect, be here now, yada yada. That's just another dualistic assumption. It's kind of paradoxical, but when you throw out platitudes like that, it's like, don't you realize you're attached to the void, and that's just like another part of the. That's just another. That's another end of the spectrum, you could say. So true non-duality is having this relationship. I see it's the Trinity. It's the knowing of the oneness, knowing of our separateness, and then bridging the gap and having the relationship between them. That is non-duality. It's just hard
That's
to
great.
speak about, right? It's
Yeah.
hard to speak about because we have to speak in absolutes. There's no ways you can imagine it, sort of, you can feel this relationship, but when you try to speak about it in platitudes, it just gets lost in duality. It gets lost in either polarity. So if you look at it as a triad, a relationship, that's a little more beneficial and useful, I feel. It's both, it's both and neither. And
Very
it's
paradoxical,
it's
ultimately.
paradoxical, light and dark, zero and one, and it's one relationship between God and infinite power and your separate feudal humanness, and that's the dance. Yeah. So it is all one, but it also isn't all one. You can just go back and forth. You can just keep going. I can just keep going on platitude upon platitude.
Like a flicker switch. You just keep flickering, and
Mm-hmm.
that constant flicker is the dance.
That's the dance. The dance of the Tao.
Yeah.
Wonderful stuff. Yeah. Now, let me ask you this one. Why would we, if there an incentive to being able to see this, being able to feel this in one's life? Do you feel as though there is a lessening of suffering, more happiness, more joy or peace that comes about finding this and realizing this relationship?
I think to a very large extent, yes, because you're given the tools to use your conscious awareness detach and attach at the appropriate times to this game of life that we're playing
Yeah.
individually.
Mm.
I think and the more you practice, and I say practice lightly because to some people that might mean praying so many times a day, doing all these meditations, retreats, being on the best diet, doing all these practices and relying on them, which is good, but the true practice is just where are you directing your attention,
Yeah.
your awareness? And these external practices are great to bring you back to it, but that's what I mean by practice. It's just when you're zoning out, lost in the hypnosis of the world, it's like back to self. Let me acknowledge the situation with my conscious awareness. No matter how I'm feeling, good or bad, let myself experience that game character that I'm playing, but it's knowing when to detach as the observer. And the more you do that, the more like I know it might sound a bit weird, but even in my bad moments now, the more I practice this, I I they're not as bad. Like they're still bad, but I actually enjoy the process of it, which sounds strange. So I would, if I had a moment where I needed to cry, I would cry as myself, but with my conscious awareness, I would say, I would actually feel the relief of those
Yeah.
tears.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a shift of perspective and see the positivity in that. And so if you keep practicing that, it's like, well, can happiness be something that you can maintain throughout? But again, happiness, I'm not too sure if I'd say that word. It's more just peace.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a peace and acceptance. I'm not too sure if I'm articulating this nicely, but
Definitely.
it's like no matter what you're dealing with, you can deal with it physically, but internally, you really can be sitting in the back seat and just observing
Mm-hmm.
throughout. And that's accessible to you in presence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amen. Yeah. Radical acceptance. That's what I like to say.
Radical acceptance.
Right? And that leads to, I feel, less resistance.
Mm.
As we said, you're either with it or against it. So with this state of awareness, ultimate presence, ultimate awareness, we're able to surf the waves, as we
Yeah.
said before. And that leads to less suffering. Yes, essentially. Happiness. We could say happiness. That is maybe a rather generic term at this point. But yeah, for lack of a better term, keeping it simple, happiness, you know? Yeah. And I think that's something we all yearn for. Happiness, joy, peace, right? Those are all great buzzwords we all yearn for in the spiritual community. We just don't know how to go about finding it. We look for it in the waves. We look for it in the pursuits, in materialism altogether. And it always comes up short. You know, we never truly find it there. We don't negate that stuff. I think the path is learning also not to negate that stuff, but to realize that materialism isn't the highest pursuit per se. That's truly special. You know, to be able to realize that it's here and now. Truly, it's here and now. It really just comes from this state of presence, ultimate awareness, ultimate awareness.
Yeah, I really like that. I think what came to my mind right now is just to support your statements is that it's like a tree growing, the branches and the leaves, and you're trying to find happiness within the leaves without realizing you are the tree growing them all in the first place.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And so you pull out a leaf or you pull out a branch and the growth stops within it because it's dead. And it never lasts long because you focused on just chasing what was growing from you, not realizing that you are the growth itself and that you can always grow more branches and leaves. And it's always coming back to self-love. I do truly believe that this reality, this existence operates from a place of love. I
Mm-hmm.
don't mean in a whimsical way, so to speak, but truly in a neutral way. It always comes back to yourself because your perspective on other things is truly a reflection a reflection of you. And so you can look at things from a good place, from a bad place. It's you at the end of the day to come back
Mm-hmm.
to that. Figure out who you want to be and then you will see it reflected back into your external um, reality.
Well said. Yes. Very powerful.
Thank you.
I think that's a good note to wrap this up at, to be honest with you. That's a nice, a nice bow on top.
Cherry on top.
So, cherry on top, exactly. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, do you have anything else you want to say, or you just want to keep it at that?
Um, I think I think we've discussed a lot that I think would take myself as well as viewers to process and digest with, because they're all important questions and statements, theories, and it's just not trying to be overwhelmed by them to anyone that's watching. It's just taking it as you intuitively feel and let it sink in. You don't have to cling tight to them to seek the truth, because that can also be a painful process. It's just knowing to accept it as it comes and goes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that would be my little advice on how to take this all in.
Amen. Yeah, amen to that. I like to say too is if if this isn't bringing you back to you, this whole conversation, then it's just a waste of time. Hopefully, we served as that, as guideposts to that. But if not, then this is just entertainment. And yeah, so hopefully, this whole talk aided everybody that listened in that regard, in that pursuit. The journey back to oneself. I think that was the theme of this conversation: is the external leads to the internal to the external, and it's this dance, the dance of the Tao, as we spoke of before.
Dance of the
Yeah,
Tao.
yeah, the dance of the Tao, right? That might be my first book title, if it's not already taken. The
I feel
dance of
like
the
Alan
Tao.
Watts might have coined that,
Yeah,
maybe.
probably. If there's one
The
person, it's
concept.
Alan Watts.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, the truth is one, and the wise call it by many names. So somebody's had to have said dance of the Tao in some regard, in some respect, over the years. Yeah. Other than that, Raisa, awesome talk. You're an awesome person, very wise, very stoic, and that's it. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on here.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation, and look forward to seeing what other conversations you have on your channel.
For sure. For sure. I appreciate you. Peace and love to you, and peace and love to the listener as well. Goodbye, everybody.